Good evening. Welcome to tonight's Zoom into Nature, Foundations of Tree Identification with Lizzie Sords and Erica Henriksen. I am Renee Baranca, the Manager of Conservation Education and Outreach at Western Reserve Land Conservancy. At the Land Conservancy, I develop nature-based programming, both virtually and in person, for people of all ages, often utilizing the expansive network of conservation properties the Land Conservancy has protected in Northeast Ohio, which totals close to 70,000 acres of natural landscapes, family farms, and urban green spaces. Tonight, we are focusing on tree ID. I venture to guess that many of you know a handful of the common trees we see in Northeast Ohio, but you'd love to learn more or fine-tune your identification skills. Our hope is that this evening's presentation will challenge you to identify the trees you see during walks and hikes in Northeast Ohio. During tonight's presentation, please place your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many as time permits. It is my pleasure to introduce Lizzie Sords and Erica Henriksen. Lizzie is a TRAC certified arborist. TRAC stands for Tree Risk Assessment Qualification. It is a program with the International Society of Arboriculture. Did I say that right? Arboriculture. I'll let Lizzie correct me. That recognizes that Lizzie has specialized knowledge in tree risk assessment. She has been with the Land Conservancy since October of 2019 and leads our Reforest Our City initiative, which we launched in 2014 with the goal of reforesting Cleveland's depleted tree canopy. Through this program, we are working towards a 30% increase in Cleveland's tree canopy by 2040. We host community tree planting events, train residents in tree biology, planting and maintenance, and care for the trees we have planted. To date, Reforest Our City has planted and given away over 15,000 trees throughout Cleveland and the surrounding region. Erica Henriksen is the NOWCorps Community Forestry Specialist serving with the Land Conservancy. Erica graduated from Cleveland State University in May 2021 with a double major in environmental studies and promotional communications, as well as a certificate in GIS. Erica interned with the Land Conservancy's tree team in 2020 and worked with Holden Arboretum's community forestry team in 2021. Welcome, Lizzie and Erica. As we always do, let's start out with a few trivia questions. So let me launch my poll. Question number 1, what is the most popular street tree found in Cleveland? Give everyone a little bit of time to get your answers in. Okay. Well, doing pretty good. It's not as lopsided as I thought. The answer is maple, with urban forestry reporting 26% of street trees being maple trees. So you did pretty good. At least we got it right, right? Then we're going to move on to question number 2. This is, how are trees pollinated? Are they pollinated by the wind, by insects, or by both? Okay. So share these results. The answer is both. So most of our participants got that right. Typically, trees with showy flowers, such as eastern red buds, which are blooming now, are pollinated by insects, while trees with less spectacular flowers, like oaks and maples, are pollinated by the wind. If you want to support local native pollinators, please consider planting an insect-pollinated tree in your yard. Now I am turning the presentation over to our guests tonight. So Lizzie and Erica, you take it away.
Thanks, Renee. So
Thank you,
Erica's
Renee.
going to take us. Erica's going to take us through the first part of our presentation, and then we'll go through some specific species ID at the end. So thanks everybody for joining tonight. Erica?
So welcome to our crash course on the foundations of tree ID. But before I dive into the content, I want to briefly plug our program within the Western Reserve Land Conservancy. So the City of Cleveland's canopy cover is only 18% at the moment, and at this rate, it will fall to 14% by 2040. So as Renee said, we launched our program in 2014 to reverse the canopy loss trend and help the city reach its goal of 30% canopy cover by 2040. And with the mission, so we launched our program with the mission to increase Cleveland's tree canopy by 1, growing trees, 2, advocating for existing trees, and 3, engaging residents and volunteers. And we carry out this mission in a variety of ways. So our program is the host of a variety of initiatives, which includes tree plantings, of course, which allows us to grow trees and the canopy at the same time. But this means not only planting them, but maintaining them as well with high standards of care. So for the first 3 years that it takes a newly planted tree to become established, we're watering it weekly, we're replenishing mulch, we're weeding, we're picking up litter on the sites. We're constantly connecting with those trees. And then we also host tree adoption events where we give Cleveland residents the opportunity to apply to receive a free tree to plant in their yards. And this allows us to grow canopy on private property, as well as engage and connect with residents in Cleveland. And then finally, our last focus of the program is our Tree Steward Training Program, which is where interested individuals can learn how to plant, care for, and maintain trees. And this allows our program to foster the growth of individuals that are key volunteers and valuable assets to our program's mission. So if any of these programs pique your interest, please feel free to reach out to trees@wrlandconservancy.org. And you can learn how to get more involved. We'll get back to you on that. So our goals for today's webinar is to, 1, leave you with an understanding of some basic botanical terminology that will appear in tree identification field guides, as well as 2, to display a number of features to you that you should be looking for when identifying a tree, as well as point out features that are consistent across various genera. And then finally, 3, show you a diverse but incomplete deck of common trees in the region. But the most important tool that you can have when kickstarting your tree ID journey is a good field guide. So our main recommendation is the Sibley Guide to Trees, which is authored and illustrated by David Allen Sibley, who's known for his bird guides. So it condenses a huge amount of information about tree ID in North America into a very logical, easy to use format. However, on the other hand, if you're looking for a free resource, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources has a Trees of Ohio field guide that covers about 69 of the species you're most likely to encounter in Ohio, and it's available via PDF online. It's very accessible. So getting into plant nomenclature. So all plants have 2 names. They have a common name in layman's term, in addition to the second scientific botanical name in Latin, which is given by the field of taxonomy. So it may seem silly to name plants in an ancient dead language when they are perfectly fine common names for them. But there are multiple reasons for this. First and foremost, each tree has only one botanical name that is unique to it and only it, whereas many species have multiple common names, or sometimes not a common name at all. So this often creates confusion if someone doesn't know all the common names of a given species. Then imagine if you go to a different country that speaks a different language. A botanical name solves this language dilemma and prevents confusion such as this. And then if you're really good, the botanical name of a plant gives hints to a plant's attributes. So for example, the picture on the slide is of a ginkgo biloba leaf. which tells you that the species is of ginkgo genus. So the word ginkgo is a combination of two Japanese words, jin meaning silver and ko meaning apricot. So this is an ode to its fruit, which resembles an apricot. And then biloba refers to the characteristic fan-shaped bilobed leaves. So in other words, the botanical name can give information about where the plant grows or how it looks, such as the case of the ginkgo. And then to reiterate this point, think about the nicknames that we give ourselves, our friends, our family, versus what our full names are. So I know my coworker as Lizzie, but maybe someone else knows her and calls her Beth. So I could have an entire conversation with this person talking about our favorite urban forester. I'm talking about Lizzie, they're talking about Beth, and we won't even realize that we're talking about the same person. However, if we used her full name, Elizabeth Sords, we would realize that we're talking about the same person immediately. So yes, there's nothing wrong with giving each other nicknames or talking in nicknames, but it's very important to build recognition of scientific names for use in things like nursery shopping, finding pest treatments, and really just to eliminate confusion among having multiple common names. So plant nomenclature is broken up into the following sections. The first word of a botanical name is the genus. So a genus represents a group of tree species that have fundamental traits in common, but differ in more subtle characteristics. So examples of these more fundamental traits could be leaf arrangement, flower type, or growth habit. And then the second word of the botanical name represents the species itself. So that's a natural group of trees in the same genus that are made up of pretty much the same characteristics. However, a third word can be added to identify a cultivar or a variety of a species. So a variety of a species is a subdivision that has a distinct and often inconspicuous difference. And then cultivars are varieties that are selected for some outstanding characteristics and usually reproduced by nurseries to preserve genetic makeup. So examples of cultivars could be the Crimson King variety of the Norway maple. And then these are a handful of common terms that are important to breaking down tree ID to genus. So we'll use several of these terms tonight, and they're certainly not all of the terms that you need to know in terms of tree identification. So one thing I do recommend is that when you get your field guide, take time to read the introduction portion of your field guide and the overviews, the part that most people, including myself, skip over. Most guides use this section to break down these definitions and terminology. So some important terms that we want to point out is the petiole. So that's the leaf stalk that connects the flat leaf to the twig. The leaflet, so that's each of the leaf-like structures that together make up a compound leaf, which I'll be going over compound leaves soon. The leaf scar, which is the mark left on the twig when the leaf falls off of the branch. A lenticule, which is one of the many raised pores in the stem of a woody plant that allows for gas exchange. And then finally the pith, which is the soft inner core of a twig. And then we'll also be dividing trees into two groups. We have broadleaf, which is a tree with leaves that are flat, thin, and typically, but not always, deciduous. And they bear a variety of fruits and flowers, whereas conifers are defined as a cone-bearing tree. Most, but not all of these are evergreen, meaning they have trees with needles or leaves that remain alive throughout the winter and into the next growing season. So as you start to get more comfortable identifying trees, you will begin to build familiarity with them from a distance. So you may be able to one day identify trees from 10 meters away, 20 meters away. However, building up that skill, confidence, and knowledge relies on being able to look at several characteristics and recognize all these features all at the same time. So it's good practice to examine these characteristics one at a time and really be confident in your identification. So these would include the leaf, the flowers, the fruits and seeds, twigs, buds, the bark, and the overall form of the tree. So today we're going to start with some of the more obvious features as we build this foundation. So we're going to talk about the leaves, the fruits, and the form. And the leaves are what we will be spending the majority of the time on, as it's probably the most useful feature in terms of identifying trees, as well as the most diverse across tree species. However, at the same time, it can also be incredibly confusing. So when identifying trees by their leaves, we're going to want to focus on things like the arrangement of them, their shape, the leaf edges, things like that. So we'll start by getting into leaf arrangements. So for example, leaves can be arranged on a branch in the following patterns. They can be arranged opposite, alternate, or whorled. So when leaves are arranged opposite of each other, they're growing side by side or parallel. If they're arranged alternatively, they're staggered on the branch. And then if they're arranged in a whorled pattern, the leaves are circling the stem, growing from multiple directions at once. So think of it kind of like a spiral. So an example of an alternate arrangement could be the Quercus rubra or the red oak. So if you're confused on where to make this distinction, note the yellow arrows on the image of where the branches or the leaves are staggering out from the stem. And that these yellow arrows will be on a couple other slides as well. And then in terms of a whorled arrangement, an example of that is you'll see in Ohio is the northern catalpa. So as you can see, there's multiple stems coming out in all different directions, kind of like a spiral. And then when leaves are growing on opposite sides of a twig, there's a good mnemonic to remember that the tree is likely a maple, ash, dogwood, or buckeye, aka mad buck. So all of these species are known for their opposite branchings. So we have the M in mad buck, which is the maple. And as you can see, the stems are side by side and coming out of the same point. Same with the ash. And then we have the dogwood. And then we have the buckeye, as well as all other horse chestnut species. And then leaves can also be classified as simple or compound. So simple leaves have a single leaf blade, as seen on the tulip tree example. And then compound leaves have several leaflets attached to the petiole, which is the stalk that joins the leaf to the stem, if you don't remember from our botanical terms. And note that each of these examples shows one leaf. So the tulip tree has one simple leaf and the black walnut has one compound leaf, which is typically made up of 14 to 20 leaflets. And then on compound leaves, the arrangement of leaflets also has its own descriptors. So a compound leaf can be pinnate, meaning the leaflets branch all the way up the petiole. Think of it like a feather, or I like to think of it as a feather pin kind of thing. And then compound leaves can also be palmate, meaning they're radiating from the same point, like fingers from the palm of your hand. So for example, shagbark hickory is pinnate, whereas Ohio buckeye is palmate. And then you can also see these patterns within the leaf veins of leaves and leaflets. So for example, on an oak leaf, the veins are pinnately patterned. However, on the maple leaf, on the right side of the screen, the veins originate from the same point. So these would be palmate patterned. And then you can also distinguish leaves by their lobes, such as how many lobes they have, how deep the indents are, or whether the lobes are palmately or pinnately arranged. So for example, the sweet gum is known for having 5 lobes that are palmately arranged. The white oak is known for having between 7 and 9 lobes that are pinnately arranged, whereas the American beech does not have any lobes at all. And noting the leaf edges can be a useful tool as well. So the most common leaf edges are entire, aka smooth. So an example of this would be the black gum leaf. Another common leaf edge is serrate or toothed. An example of this is the American beech. And then we have double serrate, which means the leaf has teeth, pointing teeth with each tooth having an even smaller serration on it. So a good example of this is the American elm. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Lizzie to start talking about conifer leaves.
Thanks, Erica. So yes, conifers also have leaves. What we think of as needles are leaves, and we can break these down into different types of classification the way Erica just did with our broadleaf trees. So tonight we're going to go over 3 basic classifications: scaly or lacy type leaves, leaves that are single needles, or needles held in bundles held together by fascicles. So the first type we'll go over is scaly or lacy. This leaf type is seen on trees like junipers, cedars, arborvitae, and the leaves don't often have an immediate apparent origin. The scales overlap each other on the leaf structure. So the shape of scales, presence of bloom, which is white or gray on the underside of the leaf, and the texture of the scales are all really important indicators of species. But these leaves are usually fan-shaped, very fragrant, and you'll find these on juniper, arborvitae, and cedar. I think the next is what most people think of when they think of an evergreen conifer tree: single needle leaves. So exactly what it sounds like, one needle originating from the twig. No needles are in bundles, and each needle is a complete leaf. So this can be seen in hemlock, spruce, fir, and other conifers. I would say in Ohio, most commonly hemlock and ornamental spruces. The size of the needle, arrangement of the needles on the twig, the scent, texture, and how the needle attaches to the branch can all indicate genus and species. So for example, hemlock needles tend to be pretty uneven and are connected to twigs by a short stem. Spruce needles grow out from the twig in a spiral like a bottle brush. They tend to be really stiff and sharp, and spruce needles will also leave a little peg when you pluck them from the twig. Fir needles are soft and have a blunt tip. They grow out from the twig on a single plane. So in your field guide, this might be referred to as two-ranked, meaning they're parallel to each other on the twig. And when you pluck a fir needle from the twig, it'll leave a little suction cup mark on the twig. The mnemonic that I use for keeping firs and spruces straight is friendly fir and pokey picea, because fir needles feel really soft, spruce needles feel really sharp. Picea is the Latin name for the genus spruce, and so it has more alliteration with pokey. And then the next type of conifer leaf that we'll go over are leaves that are held in fascicles. So fascicle is the botanical term for a piece of papery tissue that holds a bundle of needles together. I like to think of it like the tissue paper holding a bouquet of flowers together before you present it to a friend or loved one. So all trees with this characteristic are pine trees. This is a trait that is unique to the pine genus. Other conifers may have needles in clusters, but unless those are being held together by a fascicle, they're not pine trees. We're not going to be going over any of those species because they tend to be fairly rare in Ohio, where pines are very common. So you can see on the slide, we kind of zoomed in to the fascicle. It's that really thin, papery piece of tissue. And the number of needles that are held together by that fascicle is what will give you a clue to the species of the pine tree. And so next we are going to go over fruits and seeds. So fruits and seeds are pretty great features to identify a tree species, with one exception, that they are not on the tree for as long as leaves are. So for example, if you see a small understory tree in the undergrowth of an Ohio forest in the fall, and it has these oblong, fist-sized green fruits weighing down the branches, and you can smell in the air a fruity scent, kind of reminds you of bananas or mangoes, you can be pretty certain that you found a pawpaw tree. No other tree in Ohio has fruit quite like that, but you have to be there at the right time to notice that fruit or those seeds. Pawpaws are only ripe for a few weeks in the fall, and otherwise they have pretty ordinary, simple leaves, kind of unremarkable bark texture. That fruit is really the key feature that stands out about that tree. And like fruits, like leaves, fruits and seeds also have different types of classifications. So the type of seed that you are looking at can give you a lot of clues about the genus and the species of the tree. So we're going to go over Samaras first. Samara is a winged seed with the wings being pretty papery. So this is a seed that is distributed by the wind. The seeds are pretty light. They tend to float or fly. We can think of the classic maple helicopter as an example. I think that's a pretty common image to think of in Ohio, is maple seeds floating down in the air. What we can look at with Samaras for species ID is how many Samaras are being born on the same structure. So for example, maples bear their Samaras in pairs. What is the shape of the Samara? Elm seeds are Samaras that are canoe shaped, or maybe look like a peach split in half, kind of that shape. Green ash and most ash trees have Samaras that people tend to refer to as key-shaped, and they are single on their structure, but born in these long chains on the tree. The indicator, another good indicator, is the timing of the seed appearance. So elms release their seeds really early in spring. They're just getting going now. And a good indicator of identifying a maple to species is what time of year their seeds are being released. So we will go more in depth on maples next month when we cover more specific features for identifying oaks and maples common to Ohio. And so our next seed type that we're going to go over tonight are nuts. So as all of your neighborhood squirrels are very well aware, nuts are an important type of seed for habitat, and we have a lot of different nut-bearing trees in Ohio. A lot of these I think are pretty classic. We can all picture a buckeye with the really glossy brown shell and pale spot, but for trees that are much more difficult to identify by their nuts, we want to think about the shell casing of the seed, the shape of the husk, the shape of the interior seed can be our biggest clues to identification to genus and then to species with these trees. So, and even though acorns can come in a variety of sizes, shapes, and colors, for example, the cap on top, the spherical shape of the husk are pretty indicative that you found an acorn. And if you can make note of the size, shape, color of that acorn, then you have some pretty good clues to get closer to species using your guide. And just by finding an acorn, you have indicated that you've found an oak tree. So you've at least gotten to genus. With walnuts and hickories, we're looking at nuts that have a really tough shell that's hiding a pretty rich, meaty seed once the shell opens or wears away. So a hickory husk splits into 4 pieces, and walnuts have a covering over the casing of their nut. So once that green covering kind of wears away, you're left with this really dark, ridged shell that's hiding a rich, meaty seed with a lot of oil. It's very difficult to extract, but it's got a lot of calories in it. So that's why our squirrels and other forest mammals go nuts for them. Chestnut, which we no longer can find in our forest, but we can find Chinese and Spanish chestnuts planted in the Cleveland area as ornamental species. Once you know what the husk of a chestnut looks like, I don't think you'll ever forget it. So we're looking at a nut that is encased in a husk protected by really long needle sharp spines. So you need thick leather gardening gloves in order to be able to handle and open this nut. It is a task that is not for the faint of heart. The next sort of seed that we will go over are cones. So if you find a cone, you have found a conifer or coniferous tree. The seeds are naked, which is typical of gymnosperms, and conifers tend to be gymnosperms. So the seeds just sit between woody or papery sections of the cone. There's nothing like a fruit or a husk protecting that seed. The size of the cone, texture, shape of seed scales, and method of distribution of seeds can all be clues to genus and to species. So hemlock cones are tiny. They hang down from branch tips and they are no longer than an inch long with scales that have the texture of cardboard. Pine cones can vary in texture and size. Typically white pines, which are 5-needled pines, have a softer cone scale. It's a little bit more flexible and a longer, narrower cone. 2- and 3-needle pines have really tough woody scales and their cones tend to be egg-shaped. They can range in size from golf ball size to the size of a football. Here we don't have as much pine diversity as other parts of the country, and most of our 2- and 3-needle pine cones tend to fit in the palm of your hand. But looking at the shape of that cone and the texture of the scales can really get you pretty far in your field guide. Fir cones will sit upright on a tree and they'll explode when their seeds are ripe. So sometimes the lack of cone can be an indicator. If you saw a tree and you saw the cones developing, but you couldn't get a close enough look, you went back in the fall and the cones are no longer there, it can be an indicator that the seed dispersal was unique to that genus of tree, because pines, hemlocks, spruces will all hang on to their cones for a pretty long time, sometimes through the winter and sometimes for multiple seasons. Spruce cones are pretty narrow and hang down. So the two most common spruces in Ohio have pretty different cones, which is good for us, makes it easy to identify them. Norway spruce has cones that are about 6 inches long with pretty smooth scales, and blue spruce has small cones about 2.5 inches long with tooth scale that has a rough papery feel. And then the cones of our arborvitae are shaped like a rosebud and tiny. So thinking cones the size of your pinky nail. Another cone producing trees common to the area that we might see are bald cypress. If you're lucky, you might run into a larch tree still planted in some gardens. And dawn redwoods too are getting more common in the landscape and have a small egg-shaped cone. And then there's kind of countless other types of seeds. We're not going to go super in depth into all of them, but we only have a limited amount of time tonight. But in Ohio, you will see many trees from the legume family bearing their seeds in pods, such as Kentucky coffee tree with this pretty thick pod, or honey locust with a cigar-shaped narrow pod. You might forage for drupes, berries, and palms from cherry trees, mulberry trees, and crab apples. So a drupe is anything in the stone fruit category: cherries, peaches, pears, berries, we'll think of mulberries, and palm is another word for an apple type fruit. So hawthorn, crab apple, serviceberry are all palms. You might curse the sweet gum in your neighbor's yard, dropping its spiny seed capsules in your front yard and making it impossible to walk around in thin-soled shoes or barefoot. But that seed capsule is pretty identifiable. If you can find something that looks like it came from another world, a spherical ball about the size of a ping pong ball with spikes all over it, you can be pretty confident you're looking at a sweet gum tree. And even if we don't love those seed capsules, we have winter avian visitors, goldfinches, pine siskins that love those seeds and will dig the seeds out from that capsule all winter long until they leave to go back north. And then the last feature that we are going to go over tonight is the form of a tree. So form of the tree refers to the overall shape of a tree with a few constraints. So we really want to consider the natural form of the tree once it has begun to reach its adult size. Young trees may not have that characteristic identifiable shape or form due to nursery growing methods and the fact that they're still kind of growing into their own skin. And trees that have been planted in bad conditions, so in really shady spots, if they're not shade tolerant, might not have kind of classic form as they're really stretching for the nutrients that they need. And a tree that has been improperly pruned and had its form altered by an errant chainsaw may have a form that is really not useful for ID. However, if we see a specimen like this really glorious weeping willow at Edgewater Park, form can tell us a lot about the identification of a tree. So the form of this tree, I think, is recognizable to most visitors in the park as being a weeping willow. And the form, again, is referring to the architecture of the branches, and this can be seen with or without the leaves filling in the rest of the shape. So this is what makes form a good identifier, is that it's visible all year long. Even after leaf drop, you can still examine the form of the tree.
Lizzie, we had a question if we could just jump back to leaf forms just for a second here. The question was about compound versus single leaves. How does, can you elaborate a little bit more on how one knows the difference if they're looking at just a simple leaf or a compound leaf? And does it have anything to do with the stem, if it is or isn't a woody twig?
Yep, so the way to tell is to kind of trace that leaf back to the bud or the bud scar. If you kind of start at the tip of that structure and follow that petiole back and you run into multiple leaf blades, then you have a compound leaf. If you only run into one leaf blade, then you have a simple leaf. So during our question and answer segment, I can put that slide back on the screen and see if there is a good example that we can look at to kind of visualize that.
That sounds great. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so yeah, like we were saying with form, this is a ID feature that's visible all year long. However, it can be tricky to get a tree to species if you only have form. So if you can check a field guide that talks about bark, or if you can notice any fruit or seeds hanging from the branches, you might get a little bit further. So we're going to go over a couple different types of form. I promise we did not make these terms up. You will see these terms in field guides. So the first form that we're going to go over is spreading. A tree that is said to have spreading form is a tree that tends to be pretty magnificent to look at. So these are usually deciduous trees where a single leader from the trunk is not going to grow very high. In about the first third to half of the tree's overall height, major branches are going to start to branch off from that lower trunk, and they will begin to grow out rather than up. They tend to have a more horizontal growth habit. They tend to be really wide in their canopy, and trees that fit into this description, so trees with a spreading form, are many different kinds of oaks, particularly white oak and bur oak, black locust, Osage orange, and American beech. So the next type of form that we'll go over is round. So a tree that has round form is a tree where the canopy width and the height are fairly similar. From a distance, the tree appears to have a pretty uniform shape and structure to the branches. The central leader can, but does not always, remain strong to about halfway up in the canopy. So when we use the term central leader, we're talking about that trunk that is originating out of the ground and how far up the height of the tree that central leader goes can really drive form. So in a round tree, it can go up about halfway. Norway maples, red maples, Ohio buckeye, and cucumber trees are trees that exhibit round form. So a good way to think about this, if you have a math brain or a pretty good spatial brain, a round tree will have canopy width that is close to or about equal to the height of the tree. So it's not going to appear wider than it is tall, where a tree that has spreading form usually will, if it's open in open habitat, will appear to be a lot wider than it is tall. And then conical is a form term that is often used to describe conifers. So if we think of a very simple sketch of an evergreen tree with a narrow triangle emerging from a stick trunk in the ground, that's kind of the classic conical form. So most of our coniferous trees fit into this. Firs, spruces, hemlocks, bald cypress, and pines all exhibit conical form. And if you can see, particularly in this image of the bald cypress with no leaves on it, that central leader, so point originating from the ground, is going up all the way. The tree is very narrow at the base and at the tip and much wider at the base. But it's not just deciduous trees that exhibit conical form. So sweet gum and pin oak are two deciduous broadleaf trees that exhibit really strong conical form. And then we have our vase-shaped trees. So these are trees with a narrow base and a top that looks to be almost spilling over at the sides. So typically our central leader fades about a third of the way up the tree. Our branches will continue to grow up with a pretty strong vertical habit, and then they'll begin to tip down, almost like they're spilling as they approach the branch tip. So we can compare this to spreading form, where the branch growth is pretty strictly horizontal before it's vertical. Vase-shaped would have vertical habit over horizontal habit. And this is a form that is really typical of elms and anything in the elm family. So zelkovas, hackberry, and also cottonwoods. I think this is why American elm trees were favored as street trees, because this vase shape really lent itself well to an effect that we call the Cathedral of Shade, where the branches of trees planted across a street or a boulevard from each other would connect and kind of intertwine and create this really dense shaded effect over our streets and sidewalks. And then we have our weeping form. So we're going to go back to our weeping willow at Edgewater. This is where the branches of the tree are really spilling straight down and creating a cascading effect. So the classic example we think of is the weeping willow, although we have a lot of other different types of trees that weep. This is a very common effect in nursery cultivars, and we see a lot of weeping cherries, weeping red buds, and even some weeping conifers like weeping pines and spruces. And then finally, with form, our last one is irregular. So this is a tree where the form and classifying the shape of the canopy is really challenging. They aren't quite spreading. They have a pretty messy and unpredictable growth nature due to the architecture of their branches. So a lot of times these can be trees that are prone to splitting or breaking up as they grow. Sassafras and northern catalpa are two trees that are native and common in Ohio that have an irregular form. If you are looking at a tree and you're suspecting that the form is irregular rather than spreading, round, or vase-shaped, I would highly suggest looking for an additional feature that you can classify with more specific terminology, just because this is a little bit of a catch-all for trees that don't quite fit the other features and just tend to be messy in a way that's hard to describe. All right, and so now we are going to get into review of common genera and species that we see in Northeast Ohio. We've put together some cheat sheets for you all to get started with features that we can look at for identifying trees to genus or to species. So we're going to start with oak. Oak is a very broad genus. The genus name is Quercus. So there's over 500 species of oaks across the globe, and that makes them that can make them a really difficult tree to identify. So what we like to think of here when we think about our oak ID is that our leaves are often lobed. They are not always, but for our oaks in Ohio, they often are. They're alternately arranged, and oaks can be deciduous or evergreen. The oaks that we have here tend to all be deciduous. The key feature that holds all oaks together is that they all produce acorns. So every oak tree produces an acorn. That acorn may vary in size, shape, color, but if it's an acorn, it's coming from an oak tree. Bark, again, can be super variable. We're talking about over 500 different species. And we tend to think of oaks as large trees, medium to large trees with a pretty round form or spreading form, open canopy and large limbs. But we do have some oaks that are smaller and shrubbier. However, that form classification does tend to stick when we think about our Ohio oaks. Oaks can be grouped into two different groups or families. So we have our white oak and our red oak. With white oaks, any leaves that are lobed will have rounded edges. Bark is often lighter colored and a little bit rougher. And the key feature is that acorns will ripen in a single season and will begin to germinate as soon as they hit the ground with white oaks. Versus our red oaks, so our leaves will have sharp points. So with our red oaks that do not have lobed leaves, you'll see a bristly tip at the end of the leaf. Bark tends to be smoother and a little darker, and acorns take longer to ripen, and they will overwinter before they germinate. So some common white oaks in Ohio: chestnut oak, bur oak, white oak, swamp white oak, and chinkapin. And common red oaks in Ohio are scarlet oak, black oak, pin oak, shingle oak, and northern red oak. Then we will talk about maples. Again, this is a really broad genus. So genus name Acer, over 120 species. Maples almost always have oppositely arranged branches. There always has to be one exception to the rule. And this means that their branches and their leaves are oppositely arranged. And they have seeds that are samaras that grow in pairs of 2. Most maples have lobed leaves that have palmate symmetry. So again, kind of that radial symmetry originating from one point. But leaves can be simple or compound depending on the species. So the common species we're going to see here in Ohio: sugar maple, black maple, Norway maple, red maple, silver maple, box elder, and Japanese maple. And then the last genus that we'll cover before we get into our more species-specific cheat sheets is pine. So genus name Pinus. Again, another really broad genus, over 115 species. The key feature here is that all pines will bear their needles in bundles bound by a piece of tissue called a fascicle. Even the one-needled pine, which I believe is native to Mexico, has a fascicle at the base of it. So it is a feature that the whole genus has. All pines bear pine cones with woody scales to protect their seeds. Their size and the things like bark texture will vary by species, but pine bark is often resinous, so sticky and very fragrant. Most pine species have a single leader and a pretty round crown. So even though they have that conical shape, they tend to be wider and a little bit rounder than a tree like a fir. And then we can look at the number of needles in a cluster and start to break down the species. So here in Ohio, we have 2-needled pines like shortleaf pine, Virginia pine, 5-needled pines like our eastern white pine, and 3-needled pine like pitch pine. And so with this, I'm going to turn it back over to Erica, and she will start going through some of our species cheat sheets.
So first, we're going to go over species-specific tree ID for the American elm. So the American elm has alternating simple leaves that are oval in shape. They're doubly serrated, so they have that double tooth that we discussed earlier, and the leaves are usually 3 to 5 inches long. In my opinion, the most notable characteristic on the elm leaf is that the base is asymmetrical, meaning one side of the leaf is broader than the other side, as you can see in the picture. And then the fruit is a small, round, flat, and papery looking disc-like samara. So it really doesn't look anything like anything like the classic maple samara, but it is a samara. And then they are also very large trees that can get over 100 feet tall with a very characteristic vase-shaped canopy that is almost as wide as it is tall. And then our next species-specific tree ID. Lizzie, if you could go to the next slide, is our Sweet Bay Magnolia. So the Sweet Bay Magnolia leaf is alternate simple in a narrow elliptical shaped leaf that is 3 to 5 inches long with an entire edge, meaning a smooth edge. The top of the leaf is a very shiny green, while the bottom of the leaf is a foggy white. And it's a small 20-foot tree that often grows multi-stem, kind of shrubby type look, and has a very kind of pyramidal columnar upright form. However, it's perhaps most easily identified by its showy flowers that are a creamy white lemon scented flower, and they resemble a water lily. And then as well as their bright red seeded clusters as fruit. Next slide. And then we have the American sycamore, which is definitely most easily identified by its smooth grayish bark that exfoliates to expose its inner white layer in patches to create kind of this beautiful camouflage pattern on the bark. It can also be identified by its maple-like broad leaves that are alternate and simple with 3 to 5 lobes per leaf. So this leaf is usually wider than it is long. And then its fruit is also pretty characteristic and can also be called a button ball. Getting back to that nomenclature term, a second common name for the American sycamore is button ball. And that is a round light brown ball that consists of many seeds surrounded by silky hair, which you can see on the bottom right of the slide. And then overall, it's really just a gorgeous tree with a massive open crown that can get up to 70 feet tall at maturity. It's very much often confused with the London plane tree, which some ways that you can differ between the American sycamore and the London plane tree is in the American sycamore, the underlayer of the bark is more white, whereas in the London plane tree, it's more of a yellowish tint. And then the seeds of the American sycamore are single seed pods per stem, while the London plane tree has 2 seed pods per stem. And then the American sweet gum. So you can identify the American sweet gum pretty much primarily by its star-shaped simple leaves. as well as those hard, spiky, spherical capsule fruits. And then this is also a large tree that matures to be over 60 feet with a very pyramidal form. And then the redbud also has pretty much all characteristic features, such as its simple alternate heart-shaped leaves with entire edges, as well as its showy bright pink flowers that appear in the spring. And if the leaves or flowers aren't on this small, often shrubby multi-stem tree as well, then the seed pods likely will be. They persist pretty much all throughout the winter. They are small, flat brown pods that are just about 2 to 3 inches long. And then lastly, we have the honey locust tree before Lizzie gets into some more species. So this is a very common urban tree in Cleveland, and they can be mostly identified by their pinnately compound leaves that have over 20 tiny little oval leaflets on them, as well as their brown seed pods that are over a foot long and often look kind of twisted and mangled, as you can see in the picture. They have a very tall, spreading open crown that reaches about 50 feet at maturity. And native species do have thorns, as is shown on the slide. However, I would argue almost all urban planted species are thornless varieties, so don't let that confuse you, even though it is on the slide. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lizzie again.
All right, thanks, Erica. So this one is a tree that is pretty notorious, and actually we have just banned the sale of them in Ohio, which is great, but they are still really common in our urban environment. So it's worth it to go over them. Our Calorie Pair. So Calorie Pairs have a really upright form, really narrow branch angles that lead to that upright form, dark bark, small, pretty showy clusters, small flowers in showy clusters that appear in early spring. If you've ever walked by a flowering pear tree and the wind was blowing the wrong way, then you'll know that they really smell quite unpleasant. And their leaf is alternate, simple, kind of oval shaped with a long petiole. I often find pear leaves drooping down at the tip with some really fine serrations. Calorie Pair does sometimes have fruit on it, so small, brown, round, bitter fruit looks similar to like a baby Asian pear. And these are eaten by birds and then dispersed through their droppings, which is kind of how we ended up with the problem that we have now with these being a really invasive tree in our landscape. The next tree that we're going to go over is Tulip Tree. So this can be a massive tree. This is the tree that is the tallest in our eastern hardwood forests. It has a pretty symmetrical form and is really known for having a long and dominant central leader. So having a trunk that kind of goes straight up without a whole lot of lower branches. The leaf is alternate, simple, with a smooth margin, and it has 4 lobes with kind of a squared off look. So the leaf can look like a tulip flower. The flowers are also fairly tulip shaped and large. They may be hard to see though if you run across a massive specimen and if they're 80 feet up in the air. They're greenish yellow with a splash of orange. So these trees are pollinated by insects and they bloom in May and June. And our seeds are at first green and then turn brown and papery in autumn. So they sit upright on the branches where those flower structures were. And it's an aggregate of winged seeds. So this is something that I often find on the forest floor in late fall or underneath tulip trees planted in our urban landscape in late fall is the kind of the remnants of these seed capsules. Our next tree is black gum or black tupelo, Nyssa sylvatica, if you want to just use one name for it. So this is a tree with alternate simple leaves that are oval shaped. These leaves can be a little bit irregular. They have a brilliant red fall color, and they're 2 to 5 inches long. I'd say kind of falling in the middle of that range. Their form, these trees are upright and they can have an irregular shape. What I always notice about black tupelos is that their branches seem to appear from the trunk of the tree at close to a 90-degree angle. So they have a really rigid, kind of exact branching angle where the branches meet the trunk that not a lot of other trees have. They're a medium-sized tree. They can get to be about 80 feet tall, but usually the ones that we'll see are going to be 40 to 60 if it's a really good specimen. And their seed is a drupe, so fruity flesh surrounding one stone pit. It's a small seed, dark blue. Birds love them. Then our next tree, American beech. So this leaf has popped up in a few of our examples. This is a leaf with large teeth, pointed end, pretty oval shaped. What I always notice about American beech is that the veins make the leaf almost look pleated. They're very noticeable. These trees are very large and have a really round spreading form, so often a really wide canopy. Their bark is very smooth, light gray. If you see a tree in your local park that has carvings all over it, it's probably an American beech tree. We do not condone this. Please do not carve up the beech trees in your neighborhood, but that smooth bark is irresistible to a lot of people who don't know any better. They have beech nuts in the fall, that are covered in a prickly reddish brown husk. It looks a little bit alien, and these split open to reveal 2 triangular beech nuts. So this is a really important nut for deer and other forest mammals. We have our river birch. This is a tree that we're seeing planted a lot more in urban environments. Can often be multi-stemmed, but not always. The bark, when it's young, is reddish brown, and as the tree matures, the bark gets darker. So a lot of trees will take different forms at different ages in their life, similar to a lot of different animals or plants. If you see a river birch tree from the nursery, the bark is really creamy, pale red, and a mature river birch tree, there's several in Erie Street Cemetery, have really dark bark that doesn't look anything like the bark they have when they're in nursery. So this image is kind of the intermediary between those 2 stages. So the fruit or seeds come out in early spring after these trees flower. They kind of look like cones, but they're technically called strobles. They're cylindrical and have really small seeds called nutlets that are shed in early spring. The leaf is alternately arranged, simple, with a doubly serrate edge on triangular diamond shaped, about 2 to 3 inches long, and there's a pretty angular base. So you see it in this leaf where the focus of the camera hasn't quite caught the leaf in the lower right-hand corner. You can see the angle on that leaf base. And then next we have bitter nut hickory. So this leaf is compound and alternately arranged. It is a pinnately compound leaf. So think of our feather again with leaflets originating off of the stem rather than from a single point at the top. This can be really long, big leaf structures up to a foot long, and the leaflets will be pretty finely toothed on the edges. So trees have a pretty narrow form, and like most hickories, really bright yellow color in the fall. And you'll see their seed is protected by a shell that has 4 ribs. The husk will split open into 4 sections when the seed is ripe. So this is another seed structure that you'll find a lot of on the forest floor. Most hickories have seed structures that look very similar to this. And so that's it for our species cheat sheets, but we do encourage you to take what you have learned tonight and go practice tree ID on your own. Some good places that we recommend are Lakeview Cemetery, Holden Arboretum, the Cleveland Botanical Garden, some of the planting areas around the Botanical Garden too in Wade Oval, Lakewood Park, Edgewater Park, and really a lot of parks and cemeteries. That's where we're going to see an interesting collection of trees planted all together. But really, you can practice your tree ID anywhere you can see a tree. So your tree lawn, walking around your block while you're picking your kids up from school, you can be checking out the trees. And now is a great time to do it because we're seeing trees go into seed, we're seeing trees flower, and we're seeing our leaves start to emerge again.
Great. Thank you, Lizzie and Erica. We do have some questions, so let's get to those. There was a question about, other than the pawpaw tree, what Ohio native trees have edible fruits or berries?
So more than we think. Say serviceberry is also pretty notorious as having a delicious and highly sought after fruit. Have like blueberry type fruits that will be ripe in June. So serviceberry is also called Juneberry. You will have to beat the birds to them. Hickory are edible. Walnuts are edible. I'm not sure if it's worth the effort to try to extract the seed. It will be challenging. And you can, with a lot of sweetening agents, eat. You can cook with crabapple. Elm seeds are also edible. They make a really nice addition to a salad. I have learned a lot from following a social media account of a woman who lives in Columbus. Renee, I'll send you her handle, but there's a lot more edible fruits, flowers, and seed structures on trees than we realize. But that's where identification is really important. You have to know what you're looking at if you're going to eat it.
Well, I don't think you mentioned mulberry, though.
Oh, yes, mulberry. Erica's favorite.
I love it.
Pagoda dogwood are also edible, and they kind of taste like a combination of a peach and a banana. The texture is a little weird, though.
Well, that's what folks always describe pawpaw fruit to me as tasting like a banana. I'm not a fan of it, but I know a lot of folks love it. Okay, so here's a question. How do I identify buckeyes and chestnuts?
So buckeyes and chestnuts have very different husks covering the nut. Buckeyes or horse chestnuts will have like a really leathery husk. It might have some spikes on it, but they tend to be pretty harmless and pretty small. A chestnut will have a husk that is entirely covered by needle-like spines. You really won't be able to handle them without gloves unless you're handling them very gently. And then once you get into that husk, horse chestnut or Buckeye nuts are really glossy with kind of that pale eye on them, kind of papery covering, and pretty spherical. Chestnuts are more teardrop shaped. They tend to have something called bloom on the nuts. So if we think of it can be it's like a dull covering that can be kind of wiped away, and they have a pointed taper to them, so they're not as glossy.
Okay. Here's a question. I see a lot of hackberry trees in my neighborhood in Shaker Heights, but I never see any berries on them. Why?
I believe the hackberry berries are really tiny.
Okay.
And we could look it up too, but if a tree is monoecious or dioecious, so dioecious meaning two sexes on one tree, male and female structures, monoecious meaning female tree and male tree. If you don't have a tree, if you don't have a male tree and a female tree close to each other, then you won't get the seeds. Or if you're looking at a male tree, it won't produce seeds.
Okay. Excellent. Can you speak to the wafer ash and the family that it resides in?
Telia?
Yeah.
Telia?
Yeah.
I think it's in the citrus family.
Okay. So it's not a true ash, correct?
Right. So true ash trees have the genus Fraxinus.
Okay. And what about tree diseases, Lizzie? Can you speak to anything about local tree diseases?
Yeah, so we talked a lot about elms tonight. We are seeing kind of more elms being planted, but that's a really classic one to talk about with our Dutch elm disease, a fungal disease spread by beetles in mid-century, where we lost a significant portion of them. Chestnuts too. We lost our native chestnut to another fungal disease. So there are a lot of tree diseases out there. Some of them are really devastating, particularly if they are introduced. And some of them are, I don't want to say like normal, but are things that our native trees evolved to survive alongside. Kind of the classic one that's not that harmful is the black spot fungus for maples, where it looks really unsightly, but it's not a death sentence the way chestnut blight or Dutch elm disease is.
Okay. Here's a question speaking more to the Reforest Our City efforts. Is it hard to find appropriate planting places for trees during the re-canopying effort? Too much concrete, not enough space between sidewalks and houses? And what kinds of trees are you preferring for the effort?
Yeah, so I want to say it both is and isn't hard to find spaces. We don't really have any shortage of planting spaces, but it is challenging, or it can be challenging to convince people to plant a tree there. So we have a lot of room on private property, but that depends on a willing property owner. We have a lot of room on public city-owned property, but that relies heavily on us getting approval from the right departments and kind of navigating a lot of bureaucratic red tape. But we don't really have a shortage of places to plant. It's more just figuring out the right way to go about planting so that everybody is happy and all of our boxes are checked. With trees that we prefer to plant, really the tree that will do best in that setting. So not planting, an oak under power lines, and not planting a tree that's not salt tolerant right along a road. So kind of considering the light, the site, the soil, and the existing utility structures. And then from there, we also want to think about urban forest diversity. So the poll at the beginning where we talked about trees in the genus maple make up 26% of our urban forest. If we have a pest that comes through and that has a devastating effect on maple trees, like we just had with emerald ash borer, 26% of the trees in our urban forest are at risk. So we want to plant with an eye to diversity and trying to keep in mind 10-20-30 rule. So to that note, I 10 meaning no more than 20% of trees in the same family, or 30% of trees in the same family, 20% in the same genus, 10% in the same species. So keeping that ratio in mind. So that note, there are trees that I don't plant more than there are trees that I favor. So I don't plant maples. I don't plant a lot of locusts because I know we already have a lot of those.
Makes sense. When you have a tree that is overtaken by powdery mildew or a fungus, does it have to be taken down or is it safe around nearby trees? And the question is about a northern catalpa.
Very site specific. So we can't give kind of an estimate on the risk of that tree. I would recommend that you have an ISA certified arborist out to look at it in person and assess the tree and the site.
Okay. Do urban trees live shorter lives due to stress than those planted in more rural settings?
They can. The lifespan of an urban tree is on average a lot shorter than the lifespan of a tree in habitat
Oh.
because urban environment is just tough on trees. We've got cars, we've got people tugging on trees, got a lot of salt, we've got impervious surfaces that have affected the hydrology. So it's really hard for trees to get established. And once they do get established, they kind of have to make it through that gauntlet.
Sure. Okay, and then we had a question about telling the difference between tree of heaven and other trees with compound leaves.
Yeah, so tree of heaven, I like to think of it as having a thumb on the leaflet. So it always has like a notch on the lower side of the leaflet that walnuts don't have.
Okay.
They also stink. They really don't smell good. So if you pull off a leaflet and crush it, you get a scent kind of reminiscent of burnt peanut butter.
Okay.
Um,
I mean, they're
with-
actually called the stink tree, right?
yeah.
So they really are stinky. Any other pointers for that one?
It's about looking to the bark. So I think of a lot of our native trees with similar leaves, like black walnut, have really dark, furrowed bark, and
Mhm.
tree of heaven tends to have really smooth, light bark. Yeah.
So we talked about eating the mulberries, and I don't know, Lizzie, is a mulberry tree, is that native to Ohio or not?
The mulberry that kind of takes over, I don't believe is native.
Okay.
I
Okay.
believe that was a government initiative
Okay.
to hand them out.
Oh,
To
wow.
see if we could do at-home silk farming. And it just resulted in a lot of mulberry trees growing through the cracks in our sidewalks.
No kidding. Well, the last question we're going to ask you to tonight is if you can tell us if you're like a specific tree in Northeast Ohio that's your favorite tree, or just a species that you love. And you can't say the willow at Edgewater Beach. Everybody loves that tree in Northeast Ohio.
Erica, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. My favorite species at the moment is white oak, and my favorite white oak is there's the closest Moses Cleveland tree to me is like in the cemetery that's right in my backyard, and there's like a beautiful like old mature white oak like right in my backyard.
Nice.
And then all the white oaks at Lakeview Cemetery too, they're just like gorgeous trees when they reach maturity.
They are. They are. Lizzie?
I think right now my favorite Ohio native species is American sycamore. I just have always loved them. I had sycamores in my yard growing up, and I don't know if I could pick like a specific one, but every once in a while when you are like on a hike in a metro park, you'll just stumble across just an absolutely massive one. And I like that when you are driving around in the winter, you can see them very easily kind of glowing through the canopy with their white branches.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Lizzie and Erica. I appreciate all your knowledge sharing this evening, and we're going to do this again with a deep dive about oaks and maples on May 17th, same time. So please register on the Land Conservancy's website and join us in a couple of weeks to learn a little bit more about oaks and maples. Thanks, Lizzie and Erica.
Thanks,
Renee.